author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Politics and politicians creating upheaval the world over, whether foreign or domestic. It seems that the second oldest profession is, as Ronald Reagan once observed, acting somewhat like the first. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we discuss the Ukrainian counteroffensive, gun rights in America, the demise of the oil market, and the 2024 primary circus. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Kankakee, Illinois on WKAN 1320 AM and 103.3 FM. Thanks for being here and being part of the team. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. The much coveted black gold Texas tea, oil that is facing a tricky time of late. Not content with being considered the root of all climate evil, it seems the once reliable indicators have gone haywire. So what's happening with oil? Liberty Nation's economics editor, Mr. Andrew Mann, joins us to unravel the troubles ahead for black gold. Welcome back, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, is there a supply and demand issue facing the oil markets that seems to be impacting consumers? I think that's the best way to put it, right?
Well, it's a very challenging way to assess the oil markets today, because the biggest story, of course, right now in the global energy markets was the recent OPEC meeting in Vienna. And Saudi Arabia said they would slash output by 1 million barrels a day in July. And then OPEC Plus, which is the allies of OPEC, they said that they're going to extend their production cuts throughout 2024. Now, at initially, this set in overnight trading, this sent oil markets up about at most 2.5%. But as the trading sessions went on, oil price actually fell on the June 5th trading session because of two things. One is that the demand is not strong enough, both in the U.S. and in China. And two, the investors are not seeing the global deficits happening in the second half of 2023.
So what does this mean for, let's say, American consumers, that OPEC's going to drop their production by 1 million barrels per day? I mean, that seems like quite a lot, I would suggest. And will that inflate the cost at the pump during, let's be fair, during the run-up to the election?
Well, this is actually the one that is in addition to all the other production cuts that have been happening by Saudis, by OPEC, and by Russia. Now, for your broader question, it's really funny, because if there is a recession and that annihilates demand, then that would bring the price of oil down. But of course, economic downturn can wreak havoc for everybody else. When it comes to gasoline prices, the price of oil accounts for about half of what you pay at the pump, and then in addition to everything else, refining and all that stuff. So the U.S. is not countering the loss of production by OPEC or Saudi Arabia. If you look at some of the latest EIA data, it shows that the U.S. has stagnated throughout 2023, producing between 12.1 and 12.3 million barrels a day. Now, to put this in the context, before the pandemic, the high was 13.1 million barrels a day. So the U.S. is still about short of 1 million, but where it was before the crisis. So overall, the U.S. could take advantage of this situation, but it's not.
By taking advantage of the situation, you mean ramping up production to pre-pandemic levels?
Yes,
essentially Trump era levels, let's say.
Exactly. Now, the problem is that these oil companies are not doing that based on everything we've talked about over the past year when it comes to too much regulation, too much red tape, too much litigation. And also, there was a recent report came out by the EIA. It's Short-Term Energy Outlook, or STEO, and it said that U.S. production is going to rise to as much as 12.8 million barrels a day by next year, which is again still short, but I have doubts that will be achieved, because if you look at the Baker Hughes total oil rig count that measures the number of active drilling rigs in the United States today, it's actually fallen to a 14-month low. It's actually been on a downward trend for the last several months. So it's unclear if the U.S. is going to actually achieve its energy independence again, or produce as much as it did before the crisis, especially if prices do come down, which who knows if that's ever going to happen, because a lot of experts say that it could reach $100 again later this year because of global supply deficits.
But here's the thing. I think all of the issues here come from the issues within the US is there's been a full government, full big business switch towards let's talk about renewables. And with renewables, the infrastructure, it's clearly not there. There's obviously a lot of pushback because this renewable stuff is not quite as green as they would have, as people would have you believe on that. But what's happening is obviously it's scaring people away from bidding on new oil leases. So all these oil leases that the Biden administration talks about, many of them are useless. Some of them are going to be challenged. It's going to take months to develop, if not years. And what's happening is they're trying to do a pivot when the infrastructure isn't in place. And now, to me, that seems that the U.S. is essentially, it's going to just have to buy its oil from outside, isn't it?
Yes, what I find interesting about that whole broader discussion is that one of the things that the Republican leadership touted during the debt ceiling agreement was, oh, look, we got permitting reform. We're going to make it easier for energy output. We're going to make it easier for infrastructure. But if you go inside the legislation, there's actually a couple of loopholes that would allow the executive branch and President Biden to appoint somebody to waive off some of those permitting reforms by citing a couple of intricacies for the environment. So this thing is not improving at all. And if oil companies were not taking advantage of $90 a barrel, what makes you think they would take advantage of $70, $75 a barrel? And one more thing too, when it comes to administration policy, the emergency stockpiles or the strategic petroleum reserve, that has been on a steady decline again so far this year. I think it's about 339 million barrels. So that's not improving whatsoever, despite the administration saying, oh yeah, we're going to start replenishing again.
I want to ask you about this. Yeah, Joe Biden's been making hay of saying, well, we're going to replenish it and we're going to do it when the price is right. And it doesn't seem as though that price is going to be right, does it? At least until, as you say, OPEC's dropping this through 2024. So during this term of his presidency, that oil is never going to be the right price to counteract the amount that he's used from the reserve.
So a couple of things. So if you look at the previous administration under Trump, he wanted to buy oil when it was at $20 or $30 a barrel, which would have been, he would have bought huge amounts of crude to add to the stockpiles, but Democrats were completely against it. Now, when it comes to Biden's plan of supposedly refilling it, his Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm, she said that they would start buying once prices were below $70. Now, what's interesting is that Saudi Arabia's recent decision, the whole purpose of that was to establish a price floor of at least $70. So who knows if the administration's ever going to start refilling it based on that maneuver by the Saudis and by OPEC.
I mean, if I were more conspiratorial mindset, I'd say that Granholm announcing that we'll buy once it goes under 70, and then OPEC saying we're going to set a floor of 70. I'd say those two things are connected, as in OPEC is saying to the US, you're going to pay more.
Yeah, well,
or am I just being crazy? Should I get my tinfoil hat?
Well, if you look at some of the forecasts, even from the U.S. government, the EIA said in its STEO that the average price of oil would be at least $74 this year, and then climb to nearly $80 in 2024. Now, all these numbers will revise upward following the OPEC decision, but everything that happens to oil prices in the coming months will depend on two factors: one, China's economic rebound, and two, recession in either the United States or the global economy. Because China has played a huge role in oil markets in the last few months.
Yeah, I think just one very final quick question on China. Everybody kind of expected it to, because it's like the world's biggest importer of oil, everybody kind of expected it once it opened up again after COVID to be pulling those oil reserves in, it basically increasing its stocks, pushing the price down globally. But that didn't happen, did it?
No, it hasn't happened at all, because the economic rebound from after the pandemic, it's been weak. You look at the latest purchasing managers indexes, which monitor the trends of certain sectors like manufacturing. It's contracted for the last few months. So overall, China, its imports actually fell 16% in April, and on a year-over-year basis, actually fell 1.1%, which is the first time in February. So yes, so China, its economy isn't as strong as many expected, so that's also weighing on oil.
Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With the explosion at the Kakhovka power plant, which breached the dam, we see blame from both sides. Russia blaming Ukraine, Ukraine blaming Russia for what is clearly quite an ecological and humanitarian disaster, as well as quite likely a military boon to one side or the other. Now, to figure out what we think is happening, because obviously we don't have the whole answers here, we're joined by Liberty Nation's military affairs correspondent, retired Air Force pilot, and former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller, Mr. Dave Patterson. Thanks for being with us, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
So, Dave, first, for anybody who hasn't caught the news, what's happened in Ukraine here?
Well, early in the morning of the 6th of June, several explosions took place on the Kakhovka Dam in southeastern Ukraine. The dam is located about 33 miles south of Kherson City, southeast of Kherson City. And the consequence of it is that there was significant flooding. President of Ukraine, Zelensky, called it an eco-disaster. And from the looks of the pictures, I'd say it was fairly extensive, causing a lot of problems. On the Russian side of this city that is disputed and is about the Russians evacuated about 25,000 people by rail. The Ukrainians on their side about 17,000. And as you said, both sides are pointing the finger at the other and claiming that the other is responsible.
Okay, now there's quite the consensus. I was watching something called Euronews a couple of days ago, and it's as bad as it sounds. They had Jens Stoltenberg of the UN. They had a number of EU figures. They had a number of European leaders, including Olaf Scholz, all talking about how this is an attack by Russia and it's a war crime. Now, we obviously know that Russia has in the past been willing to engage in this kind of behavior before. But we also have people on the other side of the argument, and these are not, I'm loath to say this because this is very much a left-wing media kind of thing, but they're supporting the Russian position on this issue, as in they're saying that it doesn't make sense for Russia to do it on this occasion. And these are some notable people, and I think, in all fairness, they've looked at the evidence and they've drawn their conclusions, and the other side has looked at its evidence and drawn its conclusions. But Dave, you are a keen student of geopolitical situations, military history, military stratagem. What's your take? Well,
I think that you have to look at this from the standpoint of who benefits. And to be perfectly candid, it's a toss-up here, but I think that the ball lands in the Russian court as to who benefits. The Russians have not done well. They have been summarily beaten in several recent clashes and on the battlefield. They're not doing well overall, and they're using up their ammunition and they're having trouble with logistics. So they could not afford to have the counteroffensive that everyone is expecting imminently to be successful in the Kherson Oblast, which is a contested area. So having it flooded will cause that counteroffensive to be retarded significantly, perhaps even stopped.
Yeah, I do see your point with this because obviously during the winter season, any counteroffensive or even offensive from the Russian side can't really happen because moving transports over great distances, heavy machinery, weaponry, troops even, and they kind of get bogged down because it's not like the highways, right? It's not they don't have highways running left and right through Ukraine, and so if there's flooding in a region, Now, Kherson is pretty much under Russian control at present. Is that right?
Yes, it is. The Russians control the greater part of what's called the Kherson Oblast.
And so a flooding would stop any counter incursion coming in, at least until it rolls around till the end of summer, when any counter incursion would again become pretty much impossible logistically. Is that about right?
I think that's fair. Yes. I mean, tanks don't do well in mud, nor do trucks,
No.
and
Neither do I.
Yeah, well, exactly. So, also, I think that anything that would retard or slow down potential counteroffensive on the Ukraine side is going to be useful for the Russians, because then they will have at least some time in that area to reinforce and resupply and get but their troops that are there up to speed. And it is interesting, I thought, that just as an aside,
Nice.
In terms of internecine battles amongst the Russians, that the Wagner group attacked the Russian troops in the area. So, they've got their problems, and the flooding, gives them a little time in that area.
In that area, at least, yeah. Okay, moving on from threats in Eastern Europe, let's talk about threats from a little further away quite quickly, Dave. There's a recent whistleblower saying that the US government has recovered intact alien craft.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the whistleblower is apparently a credible person, from what I'm gathering so far. What's your take on it? It's somebody who has walked the halls of Foggy Bottom. What's your take?
Yes, I mean, he is a former Air Force officer with time in Afghanistan, and so he's got some level of credibility. But when it comes to these kinds of stories, and it's gotten a lot of traction here in the U.S. I mean, you have to start to look at what's actually going on here. And most of the time, you have just a whole lot of assertions, and nobody actually has the physical evidence in their hands or photos of it. I mean, if they did, they'd show it, right? I mean, that would you'd think that in order to say, oh yes, I've got it, and here's a picture, but they don't. It's always third hand, and I heard from, haven't seen it myself, but credible source. I think emblematic of the issue is the statement by one of the contributors, and that is that we know that the evidence is, although the evidence is of unknown origin, we're confident that it's a non-human technology. Think about that a second. We don't know what it is, but we're sure about that.
Dave, I'll keep watching the skies. Thanks ever so much for joining us.
You bet, Mark. Happy to be with you.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With new entrants lining up to try and swipe the GOP primary nomination, it's time to ask who benefits from a crowded playing field. And with the DNC denying debates for their contenders, what does that mean for the voting public? Well, we're very fortunate to be joined by Liberty Nation author, Mr. Joe Schaefer, who's been chasing pretty much every fantastic angle you can think of on the pages of libertynation.com. Thanks for coming back, Joe.
Hello, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So, first question. GOP field, it's getting more crowded now. We've got Mike Pence, Chris Christie, I think it's the governor of North Dakota, Doug Burgum, is also in. This is a crowded field. How does that play out in, let's call it the electoral math?
I think it's very fascinating because you see the people getting in, they're establishment Republicans, and the Republican establishment does not want a big field. They see that as benefiting Trump, diluting a possible opponent. They want someone who's going to be big enough to match up with Trump, one guy that they can all coalesce around. And so Chris Christie and Mike Pence jumping in, and Asa Hutchinson is in, and Nikki Haley, all these people. They're really Trump is smart enough. He welcomed Tim Scott, and it's like, hey, the more the merrier, come aboard. I think the Republican establishment knows, hey, this isn't good. And it should be interesting. Is the Republican establishment going to torpedo some of these candidates, tell them to get out when they're really their people? That's going to be an interesting dichotomy. You may be seeing Republican establishment criticism of these candidates more than Donald Trump criticism, and why that'll be an interesting turn for the next few months.
Yeah, it does seem that in the 2016 election, you had such a broad field. I mean, it was kind of a free for all, wasn't it? And then what happened was Trump made the most noise and basically drowned everybody out because nobody could really make their own pitch because there were so many people involved. Now, how do you think that's going to play out for Ron DeSantis?
So that's what would be worried about with him and his campaign. And if you remember 2016, it really did look like Trump and the Seven Dwarfs, or however many there were. And you can just go back and compare.
I can confirm there were seven dwarfs in the Snow White movie.
Yes,
I don't know how many there were on the debate.
How many were on that debate stage in 2016? But you can really go back and make some easy comparisons that are not going to look good for some of these candidates. Nikki Haley, you can compare to Carly Fiorina, if you remember her. She was the tough woman, and she thought that was all she had to be. And that doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's not going to work for Nikki Haley. And I think the worry for Ron DeSantis is that he's going to be caught in that shuffle, in that mix. And there actually is a comparison that would be, I think, very unfavorable for him, and that would be Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz played the part of the guy more to the right of everybody else, but that the establishment would embrace if it meant keeping Donald Trump from getting the nomination. And if Ron DeSantis goes down that road, and I think the Republican establishment will encourage him to go down that road because they would rather have DeSantis over Trump, no matter how much they may not like Ron DeSantis. But if Ron DeSantis goes down that road and embraces the support of people that the Republican grassroots voters hate, what is he going to say if Mitch McConnell is praising him left and right? What is he going to say if Paul Ryan is saying, hey, Ron DeSantis is looking good? Is he going to come out and say, I don't want these guys' support? Because that's what he's going to have to say to keep the Trump supporters happy, that he's going to need, eventually anyway, and certainly in a general election. So my big concern, if I went with the Ron DeSantis campaign, is that the Republican establishment coalesces around him, and that actually turns out to be a bad thing for his fight against Donald Trump.
So it seems to me what you're saying, and I might have this the wrong way, is that the Republican base is really the Trump base. I mean, that's the majority, isn't it? But it's not necessarily Trump, is it? It's the anti-establishment base. Is that right?
It's the anti-establishment. I think there is a mistake. It's an easy, lazy trope for the mainstream media to say that the MAGA, the America First people, love Donald Trump because of his personality, his character, what he is. They like Donald Trump because of the views he represents, the positions he supports. The big box media doesn't want to admit it. They don't want to give these people credit. They actually have principles. They actually have things they believe in. And if another candidate, can convince them that he, upholds those principles, then Trump will have a challenge. I truly believe the point where we're at right now, Donald Trump is in that lane, that he is the anti-establishment candidate. It's so clear who the establishment is afraid of. And for Ron DeSantis, like I said, he's got to be worried here, because if some people start saying, hey, you know what, DeSantis isn't bad as Trump, that's not going to help Ron DeSantis with these anti-establishment voters who may not necessarily go for Trump otherwise. But if they see Ron DeSantis getting the support of the people who have already expressed a willingness to support him, it's going to hurt him a lot more than it's going to help him.
So you're saying that the burning of bridges is a tactically sound strategy for DeSantis? I think that kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
But it's a major mistake what he's doing going after Trump. And he's doing it kind of half-heartedly because, he's not a dumb guy. He's a very smart politician. And I think he realizes saying things like, we don't need an entertainer. It's a shot at Trump. It's a lame shot at Trump. It's a Chris Christie type of statement. And I think he knows he's not supposed to be swimming in those waters. It's dangerous for him. But, he's got these professional Republican campaign advisors staring him in this direction. And, if he tries to run that kind of campaign, it's going to kill him. I think he's smart enough to realize it, but I think he has to do it anyway. He's going to have to go after Trump to beat him. And yet I think by doing that, he's going to ensure himself a much harder path. I don't think he can win criticizing Trump. And yet, if he's really going to try and go for the nomination, perhaps he has to do it. It's a tough situation for him.
Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Tim Donner, he's written quite extensively on how at the moment what you have is two large egos that appear unwilling to work with each other simply because of the positions they're in. But that if Trump and DeSantis went for the same ticket together, which seems unlikely based on the ever-increasing animosity between the two men, but I think that would be for Republican voters, and especially for America First style voters. I think that would be quite the dream ticket for them. Let's very quickly just jump on to what's happening with the Democrats at the moment and their primaries. Now, it seems that we have, two candidates so far in Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Marianne Williamson, who are challenging Joe Biden for the nomination. But the DNC says no debates. Now, I know this has riled some people who are very public figures who are basically Democrats. They always vote Democrat. They espouse Democrat policies, but they seem to be angry. I think Jack Dorsey was the most recent one, the founder of Twitter, who was decrying that there's not going to be any debates. No debates equals no democracy is what the message appears to be. What's your take on it?
And Jack Dorsey, what I saw, I believe it's true, endorsed RFK Jr. Just, as we're recording this, I think just a couple hours ago, actually. So that's an interesting take. I think it's similar to the Republican field in a way that you have to be anti-establishment to really get in with the grassroots people. Now, does that mean you're going to win a Democratic primary? No, because by all logical means, Joe Biden should not have been the nominee in 2020. The grassroots Democrat voters made very clear throughout the primary they did not want this guy, but there was no alternative that really came through. Everyone was mediocre. There just wasn't a palatable alternative. And finally, it came down to, well, are we going to go with Bernie Sanders or are we going to go with Biden? And the Republican establishment, the Democrat establishment was able to use South Carolina, a state that they were very much in control of, thanks to Jim Clyburn and others there, to basically hand that over to Biden and flip this narrative that Biden had some kind of momentum, which I don't think was ever true. They managed to tamp down Bernie Sanders. But here we are 4 years later, an RFK Jr. anti-establishment challenge to this establishment, this tired, lame establishment. Joe Biden is not popular with anybody, Democrats, Republicans, independents. Nobody wants Joe Biden. So RFK Jr. absolutely has a lane here. They are not going to let him present his argument on a national platform like a debate stage. One reason they don't want to elevate him in any way, but the bigger, more important reason they don't want to elevate what he has to say in any way. His anti-establishment message goes against the heart of what the DNC stands for, and they are not going to put that on national television.
When it's the anti-establishment candidates who seem to be making the big noise and getting the support, it's time for the establishment, I think, to rethink their priorities. Joe Schaefer, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
In the wake of the landmark Supreme Court ruling on American gun rights, most firearm cases have followed the ruling in expanding rather than contracting the right to keep and bear arms, but not in all cases. Now, we're joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, constitutional attorney, and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott DeCosenza, Esquire, to figure out if the spirit of the law is facing a legal exorcism. Welcome back, Scott.
If you haven't written me a check, I'm not your lawyer. Let's get that out.
I'll send you $1 via Venmo. That's still a thing, right? Venmo.
The kids
Okay.
today, who knows what they're
Kids today, right?
Yeah.
So carrier pigeons, it's the new cool way.
Right.
So Scott, there's a case out of Washington State that appears to be going, let's say it's going somewhat against the grain in terms of granting more leeway with Second Amendment rights. Can you give us the details, please?
Well, broadly speaking, we've seen a sea change in how these things all work since the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin case. That case requires, it's the current landmark decision in our Second Amendment jurisprudence, and it requires basically that there's some sort of like historical tie-in to gun rights restrictions on the legislative side. This is a little bit different. This is on the punitive justice side. This is about a January 6th defendant who, as part of his sentencing of probation, had his Second Amendment rights stripped, at least for that time. He challenged the ruling and said that basically it was a violation of his Second Amendment rights in the wake of the Bruin case. And the courts so far have said, no, that's not accurate. You're allowed to have your rights stripped away in this instance. But the trend mark.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think the bone of contention here is that the gentleman in question, he was charged with and pled guilty, I believe, to, it was either a picketing, a demonstrating, or a protesting charge, which is a misdemeanor. And so while he's on probation, they're now, well, this particular judge has, and the prosecutors in the case, have looked to strip him of his Second Amendment rights for what is probation of a misdemeanor. And I think many people worry if that could create a very dangerous precedent, couldn't it?
Well, what the judge wrote was that the person's role in the mob was minor, but the fact of this participation in an insurrection whose aim was to impair the peaceful transfer of power suggests that a firearms restriction during his probationary period is appropriate. So,
well, let me stop you there, Scott. Was he charged with insurrection?
Well, no, Mark. It has to. We have to lay it out. It's not just any misdemeanor that the person was involved in, and it is this specific misdemeanor, and so it is appropriate. I think that we would hope that all sentencing judges would take the totality of the circumstances into consideration when they're issuing their judgments.
So would not other cases now, or other judges and prosecutors, use this as a precedent to limit further future defendants' right to keep and bear arms if they are also prosecuted under a misdemeanor?
Well, they may. I would say that...
Isn't that a thin end of the wedge kind of deal, Scott?
I want to say, though, just to be clear, you use the word precedent, and this decision does not have precedential value as of yet. If it goes up and is further challenged and upheld, then it may have precedential value. But yes, and prosecutors throwing the phone book at a defendant, as we can see with the January 6th and many other prosecutions, is not something that's new. So, yes, the answer to your question is yes, we can expect to see this in the future.
And we can expect to see this challenged, I would presume.
Yes, I would expect that many of the pro-gun organizations, some of which I give money to support, as do all these pro-gun nuts in America here, to try to fight these impositions on our Second Amendment rights. I would expect that there will be an appeal filed.
Well, let's visit another potential infringement on Second Amendment rights with the Joe Biden administration. Now, I believe that the president is attempting to strip Second Amendment rights from marijuana users in states where marijuana use is legal. Now, I may not have this completely accurate, Scott, but it seems to me that this is a constitutional bucket list of weird things to worry about, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that the way to think about it in the broad strokes is that Joe Biden is now and always has been very hostile to any kind of letting up on the drug war. We know about the crime bill, of course, which sent so many Americans to prison, that Joe Biden drafted when he was a senator. And even as president, he hasn't released the kind of the reins on our regulatory structure with respect to marijuana. And in fact, the exact opposite is true, Mark. He has tightened it down really the most of any president. Now, there only have been a few presidents since, marijuana has sort of been a relaxed regulatory posture in America. So maybe that's not saying too much, but at least since Obama, we've had this sort of compromise where marijuana is illegal federally, but legal in many states, depending on the state and the usage type and so on and so forth. But the feds have basically had a hands-off posture to Americans who were obeying state law and didn't sort of interfere with their other rights. But that's now changing, and massively so. The Biden administration is coming after Americans who use marijuana to strip them of their gun rights. It seems like they're using simply everything they can to try to strip gun rights from Americans wherever they can, whether that's at, trying to pass new laws that strip their rights, working through the courts, and in this way through the executive agencies. But
surely there's a separation issue here, isn't there?
Well, it's not so much, I think it's a separation issue as them overstepping their bounds, that people who haven't been necessarily convicted of anything may suffer the loss of their rights. This is a cautionary tale, Mark, for all Americans who live in states where, in order to procure marijuana legally under state law, they have to sign up or be put on some registry or get a prescription that's then entered into a central database, because those databases and those that information is now being used against them, and we can only expect. The smart money bet is that it's not going to be used less in the future, but there'll be more avenues of stripping Americans' rights in the future.
So let's call back to the Bruen decision for a second that we started this Talking Liberty segment on, Scott. With both the Washington State case and to a greater extent what the Joe Biden administration is attempting now with marijuana users, do you see this as a full court press back against the landmark Supreme Court ruling? And is there any way for the Supreme Court to restate and restate again what they've already stated?
Right. Well, that is the bane of a Supreme Court justice's existence, I imagine, when they've clearly articulated the law and they get back something else from the lower courts. I do see this as a doubling and tripling down on a push for any possible way for them to restrict Americans' gun rights. That's sort of how I process it all. And for the courts, Bruen was only a 2022 case. So in the now 24-hour news cycle, we are, I think, accustomed to seeing things happen very quickly, but that's generally not the way courts work. And on major issues like this, I would expect to see a slower pace getting to the result, hopefully, which is the full expression of the implementation of the Bruen decision and more rights respected by the feds on gun rights.
And Scott D. Cosenza will be covering all the gun news on the pages of libertynation.com. Scott, thanks ever so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
And that just about wraps us up for this week on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank today's guests, Andrew Moran, Dave Patterson, Joe Schaefer, and Scott D. Cosenza, and of course you, the listeners, for joining us. To leave you with a smile for this week, I'd just like to share one of my favorite ancient Chinese proverbs. It goes, "Unless we change direction, we're likely to end up where we were headed." Now, there's something to think about there when we consider the particular direction that the US is heading in, one in which inflation robs people of their savings and their futures, where the price of essential goods, oil, and even food are both unstable and increasing. We have to realize that this is likely what's behind the anti-establishment sentiment so much of the country is feeling. Now, polling tells that just 33% of likely US voters think the country is headed in the right direction, and that's not a good number for people, and certainly not a good number for politicians. Sometimes it feels as though the world is reaching a grand crescendo, and no election, regardless of the result, is going to fix the deafening cacophony that follows behind that. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone, hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner, joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors, deconstructing leftist narratives, debating the hot topics, and remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.